Hello and welcome to the Euranet Plus debate, broadcasting live from here in the European Parliament in Brussels. I'm Dave Keating, and I'm joined today by the Dutch Green MEP, Bas Eickhout, who is running to succeed Jean-Claude Juncker as European Commission President. I'll be taking questions for Bas from journalists from around Europe via the Euranet Plus network. Bas, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Glad to be here, thank you.
Now, the process in which you are running to be Commission President is called the Spitzenkandidat process, which is a complicated word for us English speakers, but it's
just German.
Yeah, well, all German words are complicated for English speakers. But it essentially means each political family in Europe is putting forward a candidate for European Commission President, and whichever group can attract the most votes, which may or may not be the group that wins the most seats in the Parliament, their candidate becomes Commission President. Now, this was used for the first time in the last European Parliament election in 2014, but it's controversial. A lot of EU leaders oppose the system, most notably French President Emmanuel Macron. And even here in the European Parliament, the ALDE group of liberals are opposing the system, although they're kind of half taking part.
Sort of opposing, yeah.
Yeah. What's your take on this? I mean, would you call yourself a firm defender of the Spitzenkandidat system?
Yes, I do. Probably otherwise I wouldn't participate in it either. No, but what is very important, of course the heads of state don't like it because they prefer that they, in a closed room, come to a candidate and that will be then the new president of the Commission. Well, for sure, if you want to have a democratic process, it needs to be much more open than just somewhere in a room with 28 heads of state. So it's an improvement. What is important is that for the voters, they do realize that if you are voting for the European Parliament, it will determine how future policies of the European Commission will look like. And by this Spitzenkandidat process, you are linking that more clearly by saying, okay, you vote on different political groups, and the political group that is getting more of the votes will have a better and a bigger say in what the European Commission is going to do. So I think it's a big improvement to the past. Of course, we would prefer a real European process so that the head of the list can really be elected by all the member states, by all the people in the member states. That's not there yet, but this is just, I would say, European democracy in progress.
Well, one of the criticisms of the process is that it kind of automatically benefits the biggest group in the Parliament, which is currently the center-right EPP, European People's Party, and projected to continue to be the EPP in the next Parliament. Of course, the Greens are one of the smaller parties in the Parliament. What is the pathway by which the Greens could have their candidate become Commission President?
Well, I think 5 years ago, all the different parties were saying, okay, the biggest party, the one that gets the biggest in the elections, will deliver the Commission and President. And that's how we got to Juncker. I think it will be different this time. For the first time now, you will see negotiations on a program much more, so that the different political parties will say, okay, Christian Democrats, you likely become the biggest again. By the way, we can still prevent that from happening by voting correctly, I would say. But okay, if they are biggest, they will have the first draw to try to form a majority. But the Christian Democrats don't have a majority, and they will have choices to be made. Within their party, there are several that want to go with a right-wing coalition. I don't think that will bring a majority, to be very honest, so they have to look to the progressive side of the house. And there, of course, you will also find the European Greens, and we will have our very clear demands putting on the table, and then if Manfred Weber is willing to give us a lot of these issues, and we can get a program which really has a very clear green contents on it, then we are willing to go in that direction. But if not, then of course others may get the attempt to form a majority. And in the end, also the Greens can get that chance to form a majority of the European Parliament. So this time it's really going to be negotiations on a program, and really the ones that can shape a majority, that can deliver the President of the Commission.
And as you say, it's an unpredictable election this year, so anything could really happen, particularly in terms of a group becoming a kingmaker.
I think it would be, what is really good of these elections, I would say, is that probably for the first time, the two big groups, Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, together will not have a majority. And of course, those two big groups have been having this majority as long as the European Parliament exists. So they really shaped the current Europe. So if you really want to see a different Europe, you have to deviate from those two big groups. And I think for the first time that will happen. And then, of course, that will give power more to smaller parties like the European Greens to really influence the new program.
So if you were to become the next Commission President, what would you say are your top 3 brief priorities?
Sure. Well, the top 3 are very, very straightforward for us. First of all, fighting climate change. Very clearly, this is one of our big challenges, so we need to address climate change, and Europe needs to be much more active on climate policy. So that's the first demand, and we can go in details in which sectors that means, but this is really a broad program for the Greens, of course, also linked to our future innovation, future industrial agenda. That's one. Secondly, well, you can call it social Europe, but I think it's very important to look at fair taxation, to make sure that it's the big companies who are now paying less and less taxation are really paying a fair price. And of course, that also means that the people, so Europe is more going to work for the people instead of the big corporations. The third topic, a democratic Europe. If you see the developments in Europe, the rule of law being, undercut by more and more countries, really, this is the core. These are the fundamentals where our European democracy is built on. And really, the new European Commission needs to be much tougher and also much more objective to the different countries. Because unfortunately, this European Commission has made the rule of law a party political instrument. Being tough on Poland because their government is not part of the two big groups. Not tough on Hungary. Fortunately, the European Parliament, under the leadership of the Greens, made sure that now also Hungary is under scrutiny. But you really see this party politics. Rule of law and party politics should never happen. These are fundamental values that any European Commission objectively should uphold.
Let's take our first question from the Euranet Plus network. I believe our first question is coming from Balázs. He is with MTVA in Hungary.
If it would be a question of choice for the Greens as a decisive vote regarding the next president of the Commission, who are you going to back? The EPP's candidate, Mr. Weber, or the SND's candidate, Mr. Timmermans?
So as you mentioned, it depends, I imagine, on discussions in the parliament, but who are you inclined to support right now?
Well, I think it's clear that it will be difficult for the Greens to support Manfred Weber. How he is developing his program, where he's trying to keep all the different Christian Democrats together, including the Fidesz party of Hungary, of Orban, who is so clearly going against the core values of Europe. If that's what you're working with, then it's really, you need to show then very clearly that you're going to deviate from your decisions of the past. So I think there with Manfred Weber, it's not going to be easy, but we're not saying it's impossible, but really something needs to change. But to be very honest, Frans Timmermans, he has been vice president of this European Commission for 5 years. He has been shaping European policies for 5 years. And we are very critical on how Europe developed. So in that sense, also Frans Timmermans really has to show where he really stands. And to be very honest, he's quite often a bit unclear where he really stands. He's riding the waves, what is at that moment in the news, but we really need to feel where he really stands. So it's for both candidates, not clear yet, and it depends really on the negotiations.
You say one of your main criticisms for Weber is that he hasn't been tough on Orban, Orban, who is a member of the EPP. The center-left S&D group also has some members who are having some rule of law problems. But would you say that Frans Timmermans' outspokenness on the subject as vice president allays those concerns for you? Or do you have equal concerns about that with him?
No, I do think that Frans Timmermans has been more outspoken on these issues of rule of law, although, for example, towards Romania, we still need to see. He has done some good speeches, but I would say Frans Timmermans' strength is in his speeches. But what kind of actions? Because still we see the situation in Romania is deteriorating. So this party is also more and more going for a kind of an anti-EU campaign, it's part of the social democratic family still. So besides nice speeches, we also want to see a European Commission that acts. And I think there also Frans Timmermans need to prove more.
Well, obviously for the Greens, climate change is a big issue, and we have our next question on that subject, and specifically the Fridays for Future student protests. So this question is coming from Diego with S Radio Castile and Leon.
Hello. In recent weeks, we have seen on the streets of a large part of the European Union thousands of young people concerned about the environment under the Fridays for Future campaign. In Spain, the limits that were imposed from the EU on companies for the year 2020 have hardly been met. Now the horizon is in the year 2030. My questions are, how can EU politics get closer to the stricken students who are disappointed by them so far, and how could the policies be stricter?
So I think you've referenced that you're disappointed with the Commission's term, what they've done for climate change over the past 5 years. But of course, these types of things need the approval of national governments. So how would you, as Commission President, be able to push through a more ambitious climate policy that, as Diego was mentioning, that would satisfy these student protesters?
Well, first of all, climate change is now finally really becoming an environmental, political, urgent theme. I mean, over the last 5 years, the European Commission always gave it to, well, the Spanish commissioner, but Juncker, you hardly ever heard him speak out on climate, which already shows to what level for them it was really Chefsache, to give another German word in the debate. So whether it was really a key priority, it was clear it was not a key priority for this European Commission. I think the student protesters, the schoolers, they are helping it, making it more a priority for other parties. So that's one thing, that's important to have. But then, of course, it should not only be talking about climate change, it also should be acting on climate change. And what Diego asked for, some concrete actions, I think the first one is very clearly, we need a reform of our carbon pricing mechanism. The current carbon price, which is of course a very important one, putting a price on pollution, and CO2 should get a higher carbon price so that that pollution really is being taken for real.
Hasn't that reform already been undertaken, though?
The reform has been undertaken, but it was, of course, as always, a halfway step. And I really think the new Commission immediately should make clear that a real reform of that system should take place. So that's one thing I would do as a European Commissioner. How to convince the different countries, I think what is very important is that climate change, it's a fundamental issue, not only environmentally, but also economically and geographically. So economically, I mean, the future economy of Europe will be a resource-efficient economy, because Europe is vulnerable. We are a very import-dependent continent. We are very densely populated, but we still have a huge consumer market. So if Europe is clever about the future, we are creating, as a first continent in the world, a resource-efficient economy so that new companies are efficiently and creating new green jobs. And with that can be competitive with the rest of the world. And I think that is really, so economically it's very important, but for Central European countries, they have to realize that if you are not doing climate action, you will become more and more dependent of Russia. And that's what you see. The Baltic states are very much concerned about that. There is a huge debate about Germany deciding for another gas pipeline with Russia. This shows you the fossil future that some of the countries are still betting on will in the end make us very dependent of the Middle East and Russia. And I think a lot of Central European citizens don't want that. And the only way to get out of that is, of course, creating your own energy, doing your own energy production. And their renewables are the fundamental future. So I think it's important that the climate agenda is much more seen as a economic and geopolitical agenda as well.
Let's talk about Brexit, which is nobody's favorite topic in Brussels right now, but it's quite unavoidable, particularly since...
It's a bit Groundhog Day.
I would say so as well. But as we're speaking, the British Parliament is in between a series of votes which could end up with the UK deciding to remain in the European Union. This is not popular with everyone here in Brussels. If you were Commission President in the next term, how would you approach a UK that remains, and how would you approach a UK that had left?
let's start with the latter one. If the UK will leave the European Union, which indeed we all still hope it will not happen, I think it's very clear that in our future relation, we need to have a very good relation. The United Kingdom is geopolitically a very important ally for the European Union. Just think of the international negotiations on climate. There, you need to make sure that you do that together, that you remain doing that together. It's really pointless if the EU is doing negotiations and then the United Kingdom is doing that on their own. We will always have this same agenda internationally, so we need to work together with that. And I think also our future trade relations should be very close. And therefore, I think also the best way to have a future UK outside the EU is where they are still very closely linked to the common market, because economically that makes the most sense for the both of us. So I think that is in the end, you can translate that into a soft Brexit, but I think that's the only thing that matters. If the UK remains, I think we all will realize that we have a very divided country. And I think this is one of the key concerns we need to address the first. The entire Brexit process was party politics. It was Theresa May just trying to get a Tory deal, trying to find a Tory majority in her own parliament, and more or less leaving the Labour Party out. But on the other hand, the Labour Party was also doing just party politics, going against any proposal of Theresa May because it was not their proposal. So you see two big blocs in the United Kingdom that are just not willing and capable to work, and that has now spread into the country. There's a huge divide in the country, and I think we need to help to overcome that. And probably one of the key debates that the United Kingdom has to have is really changing their electoral system, because their electoral system is just feeding this very polarized parliament, which cannot address future big issues like Brexit or other issues. And I think this is something that we really should try to, in good cooperation, try to help in overcome.
Of course, that's something that the UK needs to decide to do for itself.
Absolutely.
On the EU end, what could be done to try to mollify that roughly half of the population that would probably be pretty upset if the UK remained in the EU?
They will, but I think it's going to be very difficult to satisfy them all, because some of them, they just hate the idea that Brussels will tell them anything, right? But if you are part of the European Union, you also are part of European decision-making. And I think that's hard to overcome, because there will, of course, always be European laws that in the end the United Kingdom have to follow. But I think there's also a big chunk that is dissatisfied because Europe has not delivered the social promises. That they say Europe is a project of the big corporations, and that's why we don't want to be part of that. You see that very strongly in a part of the Labour Party. And I think there, of course, Europe, I fully agree with the criticism. I only don't think it helps to get out of the EU, because the big corporations, these are global corporations, they manage to find the global best spot where they can pay hardly any taxes, etc. I think we need to organize ourselves in a better way at a higher level. So let's start to do that at a European level. And I think it's about time that Europe is also going to give in, is going to deliver on its social promises. And I think a lot of people in the United Kingdom are also really eager to see those social promises come true.
Well, we actually have a question on exactly this topic of social justice. This question is coming from Lydia from RTV Slovenia.
Lydia Petkovic from RTV Slovenia here. Mr. Eickhout, social and tax justice and a fair transition towards a low-carbon economy stand in equal focus during the Greens' EU electoral campaign. You said that the EU's economic and social agenda have to be changed fundamentally. How do you plan to do that, considering the weak common ground with French President Macron's liberal social and economic policy, which has support of others? Thank you for your answer.
Well, I think how to do that, I think you see more and more, and in every country, you see that people are really feeling that politics is delivering too much for the big corporations. I think then if you put it in a populist frame, that's the elite, right, serving the elite amongst each other. And I think that is also what you see in the protests on the streets in France, where I don't read it as necessarily that they say we don't want a green agenda. What you see is that they are protesting against a Macron who is seen as a president of the rich. And that debate you see in more and more European countries, that people feel that, hey, Europe or even the national governments are there for the big corporations, for the big companies, and not for us. And I think it's a difficult discussion, but we need to have it. If you are so much concerned about that companies are having the politicians in hand, I think we have to also address the point that if we are at the European level are not capable of arranging taxation at the fair level, you will always see that complaint. And if you just look at the tax levels of the big corporations, that has gone down from, on an average in Europe, from 35% to now it's more or less 20%. So these are the official tax levels on corporations. That went down in 20 years' time from 35 to 20. On top of that, they can do all kind of tax constructions to even pay effectively lower rates. We need to address that. And we need to address it at the European level very soon, because otherwise the core of the ask for social Europe, we cannot deliver on it. And then you will see more and more protesters in the streets, undercutting the European corporation.
What went wrong then? If you look at these protest movements taking place on the street right now, this follows a decade in which people really turned away from parties of the left in Europe. And we saw particularly the center left lose so much power over the past decade. How is that consistent with the message that you're interpreting from the people on the streets?
Well, first of all, they walked away from the center-left because they didn't know exactly where the center-left was standing. I really think the Social Democrats have really made a very unclear statement during the entire period of Euro crisis. I mean, the leader of the Eurogroup imposing austerity policies was a Dutch Labour, Jeroen Dijsselbloem. The German SPD, they have been fighting to deliver the Minister of Finance, which they finally did. And what was the first statement of the new Minister of Finance? I'm not going to change the policies of Schäuble, my previous Minister of Finance, which is like, why do you vote then Social Democrats if on a very fundamental issue of financial policies you do the same as the Christian Democrats? So I think they lost their voters base because people don't know exactly where they stand. I think partly that went to the Greens. So you see this green wave across Europe where you do see that people feel like the Greens are more credible, having credible solutions. Partly, of course, went to populist, because I think a lot of people are insecure. And if you are insecure, you are also vulnerable that some will say, well, we solve it for you and we blame it on an outsider, refugees. That was an easy scapegoat. And I think, but those people, they wanted to give a message that they're not happy with how the center political parties are doing their job. But if you talk to them, there's not a lot of people who will really say that they fully agree with the populists, but they just want to give a message. And I think what is important, that we are giving a credible solution where we are saying we decide for European cooperation, we do it together, but you're right, we need to do it differently. And too long, the options have been, or you're pro-Europe and then you have the center parties, it's the status quo, or you go against Europe and then you have the populist. I think the Greens are now in this campaign very clearly making the point you can be very pro-Europe but still fight for another Europe, and there you have the Greens.
Well, we have another question related to this topic of the EU's priorities and how it spends money. This is a question from Gintz from Latvia's Radio.
Discussions about next 7-year EU budget framework are still ongoing. Among the issues is funding for farmers. The Baltic states demand convergence of direct payments to farmers, as here they are still well below EU average and that of other member states. The Baltic states demand a more fair distribution of agricultural funds. Are these demands justified? What and how have to be done?
It's again the how question. Well, it's in the end just a matter of political will in the Council and the European Parliament. But for sure, the European Greens have been fighting for a fairer and greener agriculture system, including payments. And I think the Baltic states, they are right. If you just look at the per hectare payments that we see in current agriculture policies, countries like France and Germany get much higher amounts of money than in the Baltic states. And of course that is an unfair system. Some of those countries will say, in Germany, France, Netherlands, they will say, yeah, but our soil prices, the price of ground is higher, and therefore we are entitled for higher payments as well. But in the end, Europe has always been a project where we are trying to, converge and bring each other closer. And the Baltic states are absolutely right to say that it is about time that also the payments become more equal, because we are in the same union. Because at the same time, it's a lot of Dutch farmers buying lands in Eastern Europe. So in that sense, we are becoming one market. So then also asking for an equal payment, they are absolutely right. So that's also, we as Greens have said, yes, it needs to be more fair. By the way, therefore also paying less to the bigger farmers, so capping the payments so that you are more giving your money to smaller farmers, and at the same time greening it. And that is, CAP reform must be green and fair. That's what we're going to fight for. To be very honest, we will not conclude the CAP reform, the reform of agriculture policies, before the elections. So if the people really also want to change the current agriculture policies, they will have to consider that in their voting in May.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Bas Eickhout, thank you so much for joining us today on the Euranet Plus debate.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much.